Well, we are here with great pleasure at The Word Bookstore in Montreal at 469 Milton. And if you are in Montreal, or even if you're driving across the southern expanse of Canada and you didn't plan to stop in Montreal, you must come to The Word Bookstore, founded in 1975, celebrating at the time, roughly at the time of this recording, its 50th. We're very indebted to Scott Moody, who is here in the background. You can't see him, but he's really appreciating our discussions about poetry today here, and Adrian King Edwards, who is the great progenitor of this whole experience, has been around for so long. And I also want to shout out to Holly York. And I'm looking at Holly, although Holly's not seen, we so appreciate Holly, who's been part of our Montreal experience and is such a great ModPo citizen. Today, with some friends I'm going to introduce in a second, we're going to talk about NourbeSe Phillips' very famous, oft-quoted poem, Discourse on the Logic of Language. And we're going to, so if you buy a copy of the best edition of these poems, you're going to find that we're talking about pages 56, 57, and 58. Much of the verse here you're going to find in 56. Then there is a prose section of 3 paragraphs on 57, and then it concludes with some more verse on 58. I'm here with Sophia DuRose. Hi, Sophia.
What's up?
How are you? What's the word about Montreal? You like it here?
Yeah, I'm really liking it.
What do you like best?
The conversations we've been having.
Oh, okay, that is the right answer, I guess. Kate Colby came all the way from Providence, Rhode Island, which is very much like Montreal, isn't it?
Not at all.
In what way is it different?
There's a conviviality here.
Oh, wow. Shade thrown on the providential people. Okay, well, they're going to block you on your way back. Kate Colby,
right.
Turn around and go back to Canada. Laynie Browne,
Hi.
how are you?
I'm happy to be here.
I wanted to acknowledge that Laynie has coordinated all of our efforts in Montreal. This video you're watching is just one of many, so make sure that you search. If you go to modpo.org and you search, you click Explore, and you search Canadian poetry, you're going to find this and many others, and thank you, Laynie. And Nguyen, thank you so much for being with us, coming up from Toronto to join us.
Indeed, it's a pleasure.
All right, so we hadn't planned this, but I wonder if, would you be willing to read the first verse section? And Kate, would you be willing to read the prose section on page 57? And then back to you for the final bit of verse.
Discourse on the Logic of Language. English is my mother tongue. A mother tongue is not a foreign language, anguish, a foreign anguish. English is my father tongue. A father tongue is a foreign language. Therefore, English is a foreign language, not a mother tongue. What is my mother tongue? My mammy tongue, my mummy tongue, my momsy tongue, my mater tongue, my ma tongue. I have no mother tongue, no mother to tongue, no tongue to mother tongue me. I must therefore be tongue, dumb-tongued, dub-tongued, damn, dumb tongue.
Those parts of the brain chiefly responsible for speech are named after 2 learned 19th century doctors, the eponymous doctors Wernicke and Broca, respectively. Dr. Broca believed the size of the brain determined intelligence. He devoted much of his time to proving that white males of the Caucasian race had larger brains than, and were therefore superior to, women, blacks, and other peoples of color. Understanding and recognition of the spoken word takes place in Wernicke's area, the left temporal lobe, situated next to the auditory cortex. From there, relevant information passes to Broca's area, situated in the left frontal cortex, which then forms the response and passes it on to the motor cortex. The motor cortex controls the muscles of speech.
But I have a dumb tongue dumb, father tongue, and English is my mother tongue.
NourbeSe Philip was born in 1947 in Trinidad. She came to Canada to study political science at the University of Western Ontario, and she practiced law until 1983. And I think many people know NourbeSe's work through the book, the astonishing book Zong, which takes advantage of her interest and understanding of legal documents as a lawyer. This is obviously about language, so let's just start. I think I'll ask all four of you just to say what you think the phrase mother tongue means and how it works when we refer to it in general and in this poem. Who wants to start? Sophia, would you be willing?
Yeah, I guess mother tongue, I think typically refers to the language of your origin, like more closely related to your family's origin.
So mother's a metaphor.
Yeah.
I mean,
guess.
officially it's a metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kate?
Yes, and also the mother is close to the body of the child and the adult, whereas the father is a more distant, colder figure in this
And that's
poem.
true of young children and their linguistic upbringing in many families, right? I mean, I'm being theoretical. This is what is said over the decades since Freud, I suppose. So what do we mean by that? You know, mothers are more involved in the child learning language?
That's right. Just because the child picks up language from the adults around it, and the mother is generally the person who's closest in proximity and physically to the young child.
So, I mean, we're getting to the point where it's true, it's a metaphor. Mother tongue is just your first language. But Kate is adding to it a sense that the mother is very specific and intentional phrase, mother tongue. Laynie?
Yeah. So my first association with mother tongue is that it's the first language, but I feel like there's something a lot more complicated going on here that we'll talk about. There's a fallacy of a notion that there may be only one first language.
Oh, interesting. Okay, wow, this is a big topic. Well, where do you want to go with this about mother tongue?
Well, just thinking about research that's been done on language acquisition in brain, since this is also brought into the text. McGill, actually here in Montreal, did a study of transnationally adopted children and found that when they were exposed to the language that they would have heard in utero, and even in just the first several months of their lives, it activated the language centers of the brain when they were scanned and exposed to that original language. So the mother part is that also literally like in utero, there's exposure to the language that the mother would have been speaking in the time of gestation. Yes, but obviously it's also metaphor, and also it's clearly used to talk about diasporic peoples who have language imposed upon them as people through acts of colonization or transatlantic slavery. And so there's a tension too of like, what does it mean to have a mother tongue that's actually a language of violence?
Right. That is exactly the complication that we're talking about here. To come from Trinidad, where English is the language spoken, to Canada, where in Ontario anyway, English is the language spoken, and to be thinking about the alienation that's associated with going from English to English from a colonial or post-colonial situation to a very different kind of post-colonial situation. How could it be more complicated? And I guess the question is, what effect does it have on the way NourbeSe wants to write this poem using this language? So maybe we should do maybe a close reading of the first stanza. What do you think? That would be fun. When you read it, it was very powerful. Not a foreign language, anguish, a foreign anguish. What's she doing there with her own words?
Yeah, she's breaking it down to the syllable, to the phoneme, recombining, or finding that phoneme and repositioning it with the anguish, in order to address this experience.
Laynie, what's the purpose of transcribing hesitation and stuttering and not being able to say the word language?
Well, it's the opposite of editing out the difficulty in language learning or in having a hard time speaking something that is recalling a loss, a trauma, and so on. And when you break open the word and the language, there's a sense of a language becoming foreign to the mouth, to the tongue, whether it is a language one knows or doesn't know, like the inability to speak.
Okay, can we associate language with anguish? And what happens when we do?
Sure. I'm going to refer outside the stanza, but when you get that stutter of foreign land, I'm anticipating foreign land. And, so she associates language with geographic relations, and then later with Broca and Wernicke's areas of the brain and this kind of like division and colonization of different parts of the brain by the learned white men. I feel like she's opposing this kind of slurry acquisition of language to that strict division of the brain.
Is it possible, Sophia, to have an antagonistic relationship to your own language, the only language you've known?
Yeah, I mean,
What happens when that happens, especially if you're a writer?
well, I think I think the sound of this poem is very important, because first of all, it's calling attention to the only medium she has available to try to stutter through this anguish. But then what happens when you re-inflict that anguish, because this is the medium you have to use to critique it? I'm thinking about the similarity, or perhaps the parallel, of language and languish, and if that parallel and that like oral rhythm is there in the words, how can it not exist in the world?
So let's do some more work with this problem of antagonism to the language you write, because what happens is that if an experimental poet decides to break up the language to display the anguish, people who are expecting you to use the language properly will criticize you as maybe having a smaller brain and therefore confirming their racist craniometry, right? I mean, like, you can't win if you're an experimental poet displaying your agony about the language and therefore doing what we call experimental poetry. Does this make any sense in this context?
Well, she carries on the way in which she exposes the language itself, and when she positions this mother tongue as my mammy tongue, my mummy tongue, right? So mammy obviously referencing this stereotypical portrayal of a black woman who's a caretaker of a white family, and then mummy, which is, a carcass that's been preserved, to have that sort of one letter replacement. And then momsy, I had to look up momsy, It's motherly, but it's also like out of fashion is another meaning to that. And then mater, which I thought it originally, that just sounds like mother, and it's sort of like maybe an accent mater. But then also, if you look it up, it's like modifications. And so the play there is very intentional. It's very serious play.
I think that the five of us, having reckoned with NourbeSe's amazing poem, can have something to say about what results in writing, in poetry, of this frustration with the language you've been given. I think we should say more about that. And I'll just put into play Paul Celan, let's say, who's somewhere on the bookshelves here at the Word, over that way. Paul Celan, whose mother tongue was German, and there was some other stuff, Ruthenian and some other, and Yiddish. But after the war, because the mother and the mother tongue had been destroyed by the people who spoke the mother tongue of German, so Celan decided to write in French, and writes in French in a stuttery kind of way. There's one example. There are many others. Is this relevant to what NourbeSe Philip is giving us through her poetry? And if so, let's talk about it, because this is such an important issue.
I think so. And just looking still at that, the many iterations, mammy, mommy, momsy, mater, and ma. So we have different words for mother with wildly different connotations. Like mummy is the carcass, but it's also mummy. It sounds British. Like it sounds
English,
so,
yes, yeah. Trinidadian even.
Yeah, and the one who modifies, like the mother or the writer, is the one who modifies, which is mater, as Wa told us. And next we have I have no mother. So thus the speaker of the poem is like a lingual orphan. So what does a lingual orphan do? They play with language.
Yes. Brilliant. That's totally right. Yes. Other thoughts on this? The analogy to Ceylon gives us a sense of how important it is for you to take as much control as you possibly can of the language that you've decided to write in despite your own agony.
I also think of Brathwaite in the way in which he breaks language. He's also Caribbean, Anglophone writer, to denote and a reaching for expression that's also broken, and to demonstrate a kind of brokenness, enact it, and to wrest the brokenness into a power.
Yeah. Yeah, and Brathwaite does such a great job of creating this big analogy between the problem of language and the limbo game that that is, that came over to the Caribbean, but also was something that you did in the Middle Passage. It was almost the only thing you could do to play, and that is like the language. Having to go under the limbo stick is how language works. But there's been a lot of really interesting things said about this topic. Do you want to add something to this, Sophia?
I was thinking about the phrase, or the title, Discourse on the Logic of Language, and perhaps logic is being used here as like a logic of acquisition or a logic of learning. But I think conventionally when we think of logic, we think of like a stricter formulaic way of discerning processes, like the way, and I'm not saying they're correct, but like the way that Wernicke and Broca had like a logic to their division of like the brain parts and who get, but the logic of the poem and how the language operates within it is very different than that strictness. That like this poet's sense-making process is what Hua said, a like serious play, which is something that children do in their development and is very important to their development. And it doesn't follow like the strictest of rules. It's about like imagining, and it's about opening, and it's about like,
So let's turn to the pseudoscience on page 57. There are 3 paragraphs, and I'd love us to focus on the 3rd paragraph, which talks about the spoken word and the sound of words, and here in the context of the sound of poetry. I'll read it again, and then I would invite everybody to comment on the relationship of oral cognition, hearing, in the context of this racist craniometry or phrenology. Understanding and recognition of the spoken word takes place in Wernicke's area, the left temporal lobe, situated next to the auditory cortex. From there, relevant information passes to Broca's area, situated in the left frontal cortex, which then forms the response and passes it on to the motor cortex. The motor cortex controls the muscles of speech. So obviously, NourbeSe Philip is wanting us to think about the sound of words and how we hear. Floor is open. Thoughts?
I'm ready.
Laynie?
So if the poet is breaking open language and offering us what happens with possibility there, she's also juxtaposing one way of knowing somatically, linguistically, with something that is breaking open the brain and dissecting it as a way of knowing, which is, kind of a scientific Western tradition, in contrast with something that is bodily and not trying to possess, claim, and name, but just to sound. So there's the sounding, and then there's the dissecting knife.
Fantastic. Kate, your thoughts on this?
Controlling the muscles of speech jumps out to me, because I feel like what she's done up to that point is evince this kind of out of control muscular speech.
Dub-tongued,
Right.
dumb-tongued, damn dumb tongue.
Yeah, it's like blah 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 blah. And I wanted to push on the phrase dub-tongued, dub being a subgenre of reggae that foregrounds, and I had to look this up, remixing and rhythmic qualities of speech and music. And that put me in mind of Brathwaite as well, particularly Trenchtown Rock, and how they both remix these different kinds of speech and places of origin of different types of speech here with the scientific material.
Sophia?
I was just thinking about this passage as an explanation of processes in our body that we don't control. Like, they kind of just happen as, I don't know, relevant information kind of confuses me, because I don't know who gets to determine what's relevant or not. I guess, like, somehow we do. But in juxtaposition to the tongue, which ostensibly we do control, but how in control are we of our tongue if the language that comes from it isn't necessary, we don't feel attached to?
Right. When you hate your own tongue, you've got a problem, because, in fact, when I start talking about tongue and speech, my tongue stops working. Right? And I have a pretty psychically healthy relationship with my mother tongue, which is not English. I mean, I suppose through my mother. But anyway, tongue is pretty important. And anyway, what are we going to do? This is kind of brilliant, the way she takes these sorry, I'm just assuming they're idiots, this pseudoscience using phrenology to prove racist ideas, and turns it in that last paragraph to a turn toward the spoken word and oral cognition, which is very important to NourbeSe. What's going on there, and what's all this about? Why does she put that in there?
Yeah, I was really also drawn to the word dub, tongue, because of the ways in which the poem itself is doing that remixing or manipulation of received or existing recordings. And so I read those three paragraphs as a way of repositioning and remixing them, and then turning the sort of tongue that's unable to speak, that meaning of dumb, the presumption that other people might have about people of color, or black people in particular, as not being as intelligent, and creating a new set of meanings, and a refusal. And it's interesting too to me that the word that she uses is tongue, which is an Old English word, right? And not the Latin, which we encountered in a different session when we talked about the woolsack, which was the lingual incrustation.
Woolsack.
Yes.
I noticed that in the first paragraph, or the second paragraph of the Broca Wernicke, there's a reference to their feeling that brain size and etc. can determine superiority of white men over women, blacks, and other people of color. And so that the idea that a woman who can't speak clearly or who is hesitant to use Susan Howe's word describing Dickinson in My Emily Dickinson is really relevant here. This is the daughter of a mother who has a mother tongue, one assumes. And let's think about what Susan Howe is saying about hesitation in women. That's a feminist book, My Emily Dickinson, saying that Dickinson stuttered her way through higher knowledge, did not get all the fancy degrees and hang out with all the scientific and pseudoscientific people, men at universities, but wound up hesitating. She makes a big deal out of that. That's relevant to this. So can we talk about, yes, it's a bias against blacks and other people of color, to quote, but also women. So what is the status of the woman's tongue? Dickinson couldn't speak the way they wanted her to speak, and so they assumed that she was not very bright, or they assumed that she needed to be set aside. There's a bias.
You can say that.
Yeah, it's an understatement. What's the relevance of the speaker being a woman if that's indeed the case?
Well, the doctors are men.
Those two guys, presumably, right? Do they identify that way? Yeah.
They're making the rules. So basically, there's a contrast between, quote, dumb and learned. But who's deciding what is dumb and who is learned? The white men who are saying they are learned as someone else is not. They're creating a system and putting people in it. So it has no real value just because they say so. So it's just calling into question these inequities, these hierarchies, this misogyny, this racism that's said as if it were discourse on the theory of language. It sounds serious, and that doesn't mean it's true.
Kate?
It also raises the question of whether male perspective isn't inscribed in the language itself. So if a woman is incapable of using it properly, is it because it is not designed for her tongue? Mm-hmm. And that goes back to the idea of dubbing, as in the sense of dubbing a film, where you're overlaying one translated language onto another, which to some degree is a woman's experience.
And then there's the question of accented English. I keep hearing this, Jamaica Kincaid, who's been to the Kelly Writers' House twice, I'm proud to say, who tells the stories of having a thick Caribbean accent in English coming to the United States and facing all the assumptions that her proper station was, I don't know, maybe cleaning houses or whatever. This is a bias that actually leaks over from women who have an accent to immigrant men who do. There's famous horrible situations of the early 20th century of Italians and Jews, men who have thick accents, who are, in the way the discourse describes them, feminized. Like they have all the weakness of women, right? They're very emotional, they spend their money on all the wrong things, all that stuff, right? So accent is has to be part of the feminist critique. Let's do final thoughts on this amazing poem. There's so much more we could say, but Wa, do you have a final thought?
I was taken by the title, Discourse, and it led me, because she's talking about language, it led me to look up the etymology of discourse, which is to run away from, which I thought was really interesting, as a way to sort of encode this idea of like approaching something, leaving it, having the course be a different course.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Wow,
Thank you.
I love that. I also
Wow.
have a titling thought. The title of the book, which I'm not sure if we mentioned,
We didn't yet.
she tries her tongue, her silence softly breaks. Or is it softer breaks? Sorry, it's one or the
I
other.
love tries.
Tries, yeah.
Right. But in that title,
It's a pun, right? Tries has got to be a pun.
we have all the hesitancy and this idea of breaking and the tongue.
Thank you, Kate.
I know Wernicke and Broca from Psych 101 in college.
They're important.
Yeah, they have aphasias named for them, which are kind of linguistic disabilities.
Wow, because it's really irritating to come upon Wernicke's area, Broca's area. Like, wait, these guys, like, they cover the waterfront of the brain, like we are all in there. That's maybe that's the way psychological science works. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're guarding the gates of normative uses of language.
To say the
Well
least.
said. That's how naming works, yeah. You name it after the...
Naming and claiming.
That's right. Who
I don't know much about contemporary brain science, but it's got a lot of catching up to do. And presumably it's doing that because it's a pretty sophisticated area of science. But, you know, boy, the inheritance from the 19th and early 20th century of brain science is difficult.
You should try gynecology.
Gynecology and,
The history
yes,
of that.
and also and
It's quite...
of birthing, you know, and yeah,
Yeah.
midwifery has a lot of catching up to do, and so on. I guess this is
Yeah.
just true about science.
Or
And
how
who are we? We don't know anything about.
Or
I don't know
how,
anything about science.
like women are more likely to be injured in a car accident because like crash test dummies are suited to like men's body types.
Stuff like
and-
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I was thinking as a final thought about how if you stutter or if you're if language is a source of oppression for you, it's far more difficult to build community and it's far more difficult to connect, to grow stronger, to rebel in certain ways, specifically if like you're a woman being looked down upon anyway. And I think I do read in this like a really sad isolation and a yearning for a connection on this level of sense making and not the like Wernicke and Broca level of sense making.
My final thought is really simple. Has to do with the first stanza. If I either unintentionally or intentionally halt, hesitate, or stutter over a word that is a neutral word, I'm going to pick one randomly, egg. So if I stutter, if it's hard for me to say egg, that's one thing, and it doesn't make me have a meta-poetic breakdown. But if the word I'm stuttering is language, I cannot help but think about my tongue, my brain, my auditory sensibility, hearing your own self say a word. Language. All I can think of is how hard language is for particularly people who've had assumptions made about them, about the way they handle language ineptly. Thank you all. This is an amazing poem. NourbeSe Philip is an amazing, amazing writer. Among, you know, people talk about Canadian poets, NourbeSe is one of the top people, and I feel, and through share this feeling, what a great thing to come to Montreal and get a chance to talk about her work. Thank you. Laynie, Kate, Sophia, thank you so much.
Thank you, Al.